Snyder, and I'm one of the archivists at the church here. I've been a member for about 30 years, and the archivist for about 8. Before that, the Burr family has been the primary archivist for about the last 60 years, so I feel privileged to be able to be part of it and research all the history of this fabulous church. What we're going to talk about at this point is how this building became what it is today. And it became such through several different stages. We'll talk briefly about them. If you look at this footprint of the church, this is Drew Hall, which was built in 1864 and was the primary church at the time. Seated 350 people. There was no stage. That was built in 1931. And that was used while the sanctuary was being built, which only took about 16 months, which is amazing. Patrick Healy, who was the architect for the church, designed over 600 churches on the east coast of the US, including St. Patrick's and Anthony's downtown, which has marvelous acoustics. And the reason I say that is this church did not. The sanctuary was finished in 1865. These parts were obviously not here. Houses were there. Parking lots weren't there. Apartment buildings were there later. People parked along Huntington Street, as Russ had said, and they came in this door right here and then filled the sanctuary and later used Drew as a meeting room for the after church activities. In 1910, the kitchen was in the basement at first, and then it was raised to the second floor in 1939, but these were offices and classrooms. Gross Chapel looks strange in the footprint. It doesn't look that strange when you see it in real, that long and skinny when you see it in real life. That was completed in 1939, dedicated in 1940. These were offices here in 1991. This room, which is now Twitchell, was added. And in 2005, that whole big addition with all kinds of classrooms and offices was added to the church and has made it a multi-use facility for the whole city of Hartford. Now we're going to take a little tour of the sanctuary and see what kinds of changes occurred there. Good morning. I have just entered church from the way that probably more than half of the congregation does every Sunday morning. But in 1865, and for about 55 years after that, those doors, that door that I just walked through, did not exist. If you look at the picture, you'll see the white baptismal fountain very prominently. And to the right of that, you see pillars. Maybe you can see a corner of the rose window, but there's no door. How did people get into church? Well, I guess they all came in the front door at the time. And if you look around, it's a nicely, brightly lit church at this point, but these lights that are up in the ceiling and the side aisles did not exist either. There were gas lights on the pillars, which were later replaced by electric light bulbs, but it was very dark. The only way they could manage to bring some light into this side of the church, the two sides of the church, was to have light-colored windows. So all of these beautiful conic windows that we now have were originally just a light rose color to let in as much light as possible. I'm now sitting in a pew where I'm assuming a fellow by the name of Charles Dudley Warner may have sat. He was the co-editor of the Hartford Courant in 1865, and like many of the highfalutin members of Hartford society, belonged to a Silent Hill Congregational Church. But he was a humorous essayist, and his description of some of the problems that the church faced in the early days, they're hysterical. I want to take a second to read one of them to you about this seat. I occupy a seat in church, which is an admirable one for reflection, but I cannot see or hear much that is going on in what we like to call the apse. There is a splendid stone pillar, a clustered column right in front of me, and I am as much protected from the minister as old Puck's troops were from the British, behind the stone wall of Bunker's Hill. I can hear his voice occasionally, wandering around in the arches overhead, and I recognize the tone, because he is a friend of mine and an excellent man. But what he is saying, I can very seldom make out. When you sat in the center of the house, it sometimes seemed as if 3 or 4 ministers were speaking, but a good deal of the minister's voice appeared to go up into the groined arches, and as there was no one up there, some of his best things were lost. Back here, we have a very unusual relic. I don't think many churches have them anymore. This is the seating chart for when people paid for their pews, and that happened up until 1931. Depending on how much you paid, of course, showed you where you could sit in the church. And people took an ownership of those pews, and if anybody else sat in them, there was trouble. So can you imagine what would happen if you switched from someone paying for a spot in the church to sit and just offering to make a pledge to the church, which is what they wanted to do earlier, but ended up really trying in 1931. It caused a great commotion, partly because they weren't sure they would be able to take in enough donations to pay for the expenses of running this building and the wonderful programs it had, partly because of people feeling they had a right to certain seats in the house and didn't want to have anyone else sitting in them. You're very used to hearing the stentorian sounds of our magnificent organ in the balcony. However, that balcony and those pipes have only been there since 1962, when the balcony was expanded so that the larger organ and the larger choir could sit there. After 1911, when the organ was moved to the back of the church, these were the pipes that were there. The organ is right there, if you can see it, and the balcony was much smaller. The choir was much smaller. They didn't even allow women in the choir until 1887. So it was just men for a while, but by this time there were women in the choir. The church was mostly completed in 1865. However, there was no steeple, as you can see. These are the little slatted wood slats you looked out of when you were up there on your tour with Russ. There's much more that goes up there. And Charles Dudley Warner thought that maybe it would grow on its own because of the good root it had. But in 1875, they finally built the steeple. The reason that this is interesting is that Mark Twain came to town in 1868, 7 and 8. And he thought that that was hysterical. He called it the stub-tailed church because it had no steeple. And that's actually how Joseph Twitchell and Samuel Clemens became acquainted. When Samuel Clemens was in Hartford, he attended Joseph Twitchell's church, even though he was not a religious person. In fact, the reason that he and Joseph Twitchell became acquainted is, as I said, he was making fun of the church at a party at his editor's house across the street in Salem Avenue, Elisha Bliss, and Joseph Twitchell was standing right behind him as he was making these derogatory remarks about Joseph Twitchell's church. But that didn't make them unfriendly. Actually, Joseph Twitchell became fascinated by this very unusual man whose upbringing had been so totally different from his own, and who just treated life in a very different way from the way Joseph Twitchell did, and they became fast friends for the rest of their lives. This is the pew that Mark Twain sat in, and in 1878, Mark Twain invited Joseph Twitchell to go to Europe with him. They had been taking their walks to Talcott Mountain. One day they even, in 1874, decided they were going to walk to Boston to visit William Dean Howells. They didn't walk all the way. They only got as far as North Ashford, and then they took the train. But they'd been walking a lot. So Mark Twain thought that walking around Europe with Joseph Twitchell would be a blast. and it was. If you read A Tramp Abroad, the character known as Harris in the book is actually Joseph Twitchell. I think you're very used to seeing, very comfortable with this chancel that we now have. However, it wasn't always like that. You couldn't see the Gabriel window. Of course, it wasn't there. You couldn't, there was no wood piano. The pulpit was in the center. There was no lectern. There was no raised platform here. All of that, most of that occurred in 1911 when they made the changes. They added the doors, they put the wood paneling up, they moved the pipe organ to the back of the church, thereby revealing the beautiful windows that were behind it. And at that time, the central window up there was replaced, the original Tiffany window was replaced by a conic window honoring Joseph Twitchell, and we call it the Gabriel window. Where the wood railings are now on the sides, that was a curtain that you might have been able to see in the earlier photograph. Look at the ends of the pews. Can you see that they're rounded? They're not these squarish ones that we have now. And the acoustics are much better since the public address system was added in 1951. Prior to that, many of the problems that Charles W. Warner complained about in 1865 still existed, no matter what they tried to do. They have John Mansfield horsehair canvas on the ceiling to try to absorb some of the bouncing of the vocals around the room. And that has helped, but it didn't solve the problem at the time. They offered actually to refund all the money used to put those up if they didn't work, but apparently they worked satisfactorily enough. And the last change that we've made, at least so far, is this beautiful lower chancel that was added in 2005, marble and hardwood, which allows people, even in the very back, to see what's going on up front. Baptisms happen here, the choir stands here, the orchestra plays here, often the preaching takes place from down here, and it is just a marvelous addition to the church. We're now in Gross Memorial Chapel, and there are a few interesting things about it. First of all, it was constructed for the 75th anniversary of the church. It's quite a gift. The Gross family, the children, gave it in honor of their parents. If you can read that inscription over the door, which is faded to almost nothing at this point, it mentions their names. And the rose window at the top is the one that most people think is the only rose window we have. But you now know that there's a secret one in the front of the church. If you look at what else was happening in March 1940, I don't know if you remember that it was called the fake war for a long time, but by March of 1940, things had started to heat up a little bit. And Hitler and Mussolini were becoming not best buds, but working together to our detriment, of course, but we won. And it's a beautiful little chapel with a lovely organ that only plays loud. We're forever grateful to the Gross family for offering to give this building to the church.
So there is our video portion.
I hope you enjoyed it. We do have a couple of stories from the early days that aren't related to the building necessarily, but they're just so precious that I have to tell them. The first one takes place during the Civil War when Twitchell became a chaplain for Sickles' 71st New York Brigade, which was made up mostly of Irish immigrants, so was mostly Catholic. And they had Twitchell as a Protestant chaplain, but they needed a Catholic chaplain. So there was this fellow named Father O'Hannigan, who was the Catholic chaplain. He and Twitchell obviously shared the chaplaincy for the brigade, and they did a lot of work helping the soldiers, not just spiritually, but physically with their injuries and stuff like that. And they were at Fredericksburg during the winter of 1860, after a battle, and they finally, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, were relieved of their physical ministering responsibilities, and went to bed in their tent. Well, it was very cold. It was December. It was very cold. And they were sleeping on the ground, and they had a blanket each. Well, that wasn't very warm, so they decided that they would spoon. I don't know if you know that term, but it means they slept right next to each other and put both blankets over them. And they're lying there trying to fall asleep in this cold, and suddenly Father O'Hannigan starts laughing. Twitchell can't understand why he's laughing. And so he asks him, and he said, "I'm just picturing God up there laughing at us. Here, a Jesuit priest or a Catholic priest and a Protestant of the worst kind are lying together, close together, under the same blanket." So that was a funny story. Then later, when Twitchell actually served 3 years and was out for a year going to seminary before the actual end of the war. But shortly thereafter, when he was offered the ministerial post at our church, Father O'Hannigan, who was by then the president of Holy Cross College, needed to come to Hartford to visit with the church, the diocese center, to visit with the church higher ups. And they asked him when he was coming down if he would need some lodging. And he said, "No, I won't need it. I'm going to stay with the Protestant pastor of the Asylum Hill Congregational Church." And of course, he was thinking that the Catholic people the people who were over him in responsibility probably didn't think that was such a great idea. But when he got down here, he asked Joe if he could have a tour of the church. Well, the church wasn't quite finished at that point. So the scaffolding was still up in the front of the church. And all of a sudden he starts climbing. O'Hannigan starts climbing the scaffolding. And he's up there and he's muttering some Latin words. And Joe Twitchell doesn't know what he's talking about. When he comes back down, he said, "I think you will probably have the only Catholic consecrated Protestant church in the United States. I've just consecrated your church up there." So they were good friends too, and saw each other fairly regularly. They weren't that far apart. So those are my two stories. Now you can take it, Jack. You're on mute, I think.
All right, there, my mute is off. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to go through with you. And essentially this sort of stays with the idea of looking at historical pictures of the church as well as things within the sanctuary and within the chapel itself. So I'm just now going to share my screen again. And we will go through this. So this is a very interesting preliminary sketch and footprint of the church, what was originally built. And so you have the main footprint of the church building on the right, and then on the left there, and on the right is what would be the footprint for the assembly room, chapel, what is now Drew Hall. And what I think is interesting to note about this preliminary footprint is that they had a center section of seating in the sanctuary with 2 center aisles and then side aisles right next to the windows, which is not ultimately what they decided to do, of course. Much of the wall structure is very similar to what we have now. And actually, the entrance to the assembly room, to Drew Hall, would have been right here in the corner, which is where now there is currently a window. But I just thought that was fascinating that they originally thought, hey, let's do two side aisles, which is very similar to some other churches. I know South Church in New Britain has that same type of format to it. This then is a side elevation from that same time period, which is probably roughly the same as what actually happened, maybe except for this top railing on the top of the roof right there. That didn't end up happening. But you can see from Patrick Keeley's original design, it was intended to have a spire up on top. He didn't necessarily envision a clock per se, but they definitely from the beginning intended for the church tower to be completed. Here then is the east exterior of the church, only completed up through the bell tower here. And this is what the outside of the church would have looked like from 1865 until the tower was built. You can see the outside of the assembly room here, very similar to that plan that we saw earlier. This whole area here is a courtyard now between the chapel and the sanctuary, but back then this is all there was. And we can look at it from the west side as well. This would be the Huntington Street side, and who knows what that street was called at this time, but at that time it was just a dirt road. This photo fascinates me for many reasons. One is certainly because it shows the original balcony of the church, which was built right away, even though the organ was not put back there until 1911. The balcony was built right away with the original structure of the church. I also love the fact that you get a really good view of how far back the pews went, all the way almost to the back wall. And that would have been the case for quite a number of years. But what fascinates me most is over to the right side here is this plaque on the wall. And if you think of our church sanctuary now, that plaque is certainly not there. But a lot of churches around Hartford definitely have a lot of memorial plaques around their sanctuaries to many different people's memorial or honoring different people in the church's history. But our church really doesn't have a lot of those. So when I first saw this picture, I was very curious, well, what could this possibly be? Well, here it is. From the Hartford Post, 1887, and then reprinted in the New York Times in memory of Mrs. Hawley. Yesterday, a tablet from the 7th Regiment Connecticut Volunteers in honor of Mrs. Joseph R. Hawley was placed in the Asylum Hill Congregational Church. It is of red mottled Italian marble, polished about 3.5 to 4.5 feet in size, upon which is a plate of polished lacquered brass with an illuminated inscription as follows: "By the grace of God, Harriet Foote Hawley lived a helpful life, brave, tender, and true, a soldier and servant of Jesus Christ. Born in Guilford, Connecticut, June 25, 1831, entered into rest March 3, 1886, Washington, D.C. To her memory, soldiers of the 7th Connecticut place this tablet." And then there's a little bit more information at the bottom. From the church's annual report booklet of 1887 is this picture, and it shows you in black and white, the beautiful Italian marble and the lacquered brass plaque on top of it. This plaque, the brass part, actually is in the archives of the church. The Italian marble is not. Don't know where that ended up whenever it was taken down. But it's neat to sort of rediscover things about the church that were changed in that respect. So here is what we would think of as what was the sanctuary. And this would have been up until, whoops, didn't mean to go forward. the top of the screen is cutting off what I put in there, but this would have been what this organ was installed in 1871. The baptismal font down here was given as a gift in 1897. So this would have been what the front of the church, what the sanctuary of the church looked like from 1897 until 1911, when some major renovations happened. This was the photo that Lynn referenced earlier. You can see that there are no doors down here in the northeast or northwest corner. You can also see on the tops of the columns, there are these little tulip type light fixtures, and those would have been the gas lights, gas powered lights for the sanctuary. And if you look at the over to the left, the window here, you can see kind of this diamond design on the window, and that is what Lynn was referencing in terms of the very simple windows that were in place prior to the beautiful stained glass conic windows that we currently have. Interestingly enough, that diamond pattern in the windows is also what is in the stairwell, small windows going upstairs to the balcony. So the next time you're there, if you want to take a look at the small windows in the stairwells going up to the balcony, you'll see they have this rose-colored and other colored diamond design. Pulpit right there in the middle, which that would, this is what Joseph Twitchell would have been preaching from his entire pastorate. In 1903, actually not 1910, but 1903, the church made their first addition, and that was the beautiful parish house. We see the front of it right here, which nowadays you don't really see much of that because the chapel comes out from that. But these windows along the bottom, the beautiful tall windows on the top, which you can see from the inside, from McKeith Hall, from the choir room on the second floor now. What was actually added is, if you look at this top here, this was the end of the building of the original assembly room going all the way down. So they took what was the entrance here, they made that into a window, built this beautiful portico entrance, and from here on over is all new as of 1903. It cost them $25,000 to build this addition onto the church. It was going to be a lot more expensive, but they ended up cutting some costs, not the least of which was that they only put brownstone on the front side of it and not all the way around the entire new addition. From 1911 to 1912, the chancel and entire interior of the sanctuary was completely reconfigured. So the organ that was down front was actually dismantled completely and gotten rid of. A brand new organ made by the Skinner Company out of Boston was installed into the balcony. And that left them with being able to add this beautiful new hardwood and carvings up into the altar area of the church. A brand new pulpit split off to the left side, a reading desk off to the right side. What's interesting then, if you look at these crown moldings here, each one of them has a built-in seat below it all the way around the back. And the communion table here is actually on the marble floor as opposed to at the same level as where those chairs are. If you think of our current chancel positioning, it is level all the way across the top. So the marble right there, you would have been able to see a beautiful design in the marble itself. And if I remember correctly, there it is. Now it's actually partially covered up by the leveling off of that entire area. But back then, you can see that the floor line would have sort of gone back in sort of a trapezoidal kind of pattern. But I love the beautiful woodwork of all of these seats back there. Is just gorgeous. Also notice that there is no cross. Keep that in mind as we go forward. From 1912 to about 1930, this would have been what the northwest corner of the sanctuary looked like. You see the little doorway that was put in, but there's no carved arch over top of it. And the reason I say up to about 1930 is because it's sometime in the 1930s, after the death of Reverend Willis Butler in October of 1930, who was the third minister of the church. One of the arches actually is in his memory, so we know that it happened after he died, as it were. But you could see then that the pew ends are all squared off as we would see them now. And this is just a nice bird's eye view of the sanctuary and what it would have looked like from 1912 to 1930. The Gabriel window is up here along with the other 4 gospel windows, all of them honoring the pastorate, Joseph Twitchell. The electric light bulbs on the tops of the columns, as opposed to those little tulip-shaped gas light bulbs. You can see the side pews over here on the front, which we no longer have. You can also see how far forward the front pews go and past the front column itself, which is now no longer the case. So now we're definitely into the 1930s and into the 1940s. You can see the brightly colored light bulbs on tops of the columns there. So we still do not have the chandeliers in the sanctuary itself. But we know we're past at least 1930 because the northwest entryway has the memorial arch to Reverend Butler, and the other arch over the northeast door is here as well. Moving ahead, we now see 1950, as of 1951, we have the chandeliers in place. And there is also a very different look to the upper chancel altar area. And we actually now have a cross in the altar area for the very first time in the church's history. And we're going to take a little closer look at that altar area here now. So they've already covered up that circle cross design on the marble by having the upper chancel elevated platform extended all the way across. The built-in seats have now been taken out, except for 2 on this side and 2 on that side. They have this little, what they call a retable in the upper chancel. There's an even more elevated area above what is even currently there for the communion table itself. And then fabric patterns here into the hardwood. And actually you can still see little nail holes where those pieces of fabric over top of wood were kept in place by nails. You can still see those nail. I saw them this morning as I was up there changing paraments myself. But you see the cross here, and it is a beautiful cross and a little 3-tiered pedestal that it is a part of. And we're going to now just talk about the cross a little bit more. This gives you a little better perspective, even though the graininess of the picture, of just the 3-tiered stepwise leading up to the cross. In a 1951 Hill Church News article talking about Know Your Church, it talks about this cross specifically, and it was designed by the Angelo Lualdi Company out of Boston. Angelo Lualdi's company has carvings both in wood and marble all over the Northeast, and a lot of marble statues actually in the National Cathedral. And the article in the Hill Church News there goes into great detail about the cross itself. This is what we see of it now. At some point, it was the bottom part of it, the 3-step area was cut off, and it was put up onto, so it could be a little bit higher and maybe a little bit more seen, as it were. Have no idea what happened to that little 3-step pedestal. And maybe when we're done with this part of the presentation, if anyone here remembers, and it might be Russ Jones, when that would have happened, and I'll maybe reach out to you, Russ, so you can talk a little bit about that. But the design of the cross is really beautiful. It has 12 clusters of grapes and grape leaves, and of course then the beautiful Chi Rho symbol flanked by the Alpha and Omega, Chi Rho being the monogram of Christ, Chi Rho the first 2 letters of the Greek word for Christos. I think this would actually make a really nice tattoo. And now then, just jumping ahead to a black and white photo, interestingly enough, from 1993 of our sanctuary. And by 1993, you can see that the cross has already been removed from its base and is up on the wall. The 2 candlesticks that we have now are there as well. But you can also see down front here that the front pews have been removed in front of the columns by that point as well. Now, just a few fun things, memorial gifts to the within the sanctuary. The beautiful Irish marble baptismal font, which was a gift to the church in 1897 in memory of Isabel Chase Longley, who died in 1893. The candlesticks, which have been a part of our church for a while, but were refurbished, and then refurbished in loving memory of Reed Hollister, who was a young person in the church who died 2002, 2003, and his parents gave that in refurbishing of those candlesticks. And they're actually oil candlesticks as opposed to wax burning candles. Do you know where these 2 faces are in the church? They're obviously wood carvings. Well, they are part of the Founders Memorial Arch in the northeast corner. The Founders Arch is named, it was given in memory of 3 of the founders of the church. David Eli Bartlett, his wife Fanny Pomeroy Hinsdale Bartlett, and their daughter Mary Leeds McDonald. 3 of the founders of the church, which is conveniently why we call it the Founders Memorial Arch. In the northwest corner, we have the Butler Memorial Arch for the 3rd senior minister of the church, Reverend Willis Butler. And I love what it says about him: commanding preacher, winsome personality, devout spirit. He was only 57 when he died, and he died suddenly of complications from pneumonia in 1930. What was also described of him being at the height of his career, unfortunately, for the church. You can't sit in our church without noticing the beautiful Twitchell windows given in honor of Joseph Twitchell. And this gives you even just a better view of the different colors and everything involved in the 4 gospel windows, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are flanking the Gabriel window. Joseph Twitchell's wife, Harmony Twitchell, also had a window put in her honor. It is in the northwest corner on the west side of the church, the Abel window. Joseph Twitchell was actually in New York for the funeral of Mark Twain when he got the news that his wife Harmony had died in 1910. Our beautiful Christ candle that we currently have with brass and oil Christ candle was given in 1998 in honor of John L. Way III. Moving out of the sanctuary into Drew Hall, we of course have the beautiful painting of Dr. Drew. And Dr. Drew had one of the longest pastorates of the church, except with the exception of Joseph Twitchell. And now we talk a little bit about the chapel. As Lynn said, built in 1939 and dedicated in 1940, the chapel was built with money given by the Gross family in memory of Charles Gross and his wife, given by their son and daughter. And that's interesting to note, again, the circle cross symbol up here, which is prevalent throughout our sanctuary and not just in that marble part of the upper chancel. The baptismal font in the chapel was given in 1985 in memory of Chauncey Thompson, given by his wife. They were church members. And of course, the beautiful chapel memorial organ, the Gress Miles organ, was given in memory of Richard and Grace Einzel's son, Ricky, who died tragically at the age of 8. Dick Einzel was the then minister of music and organist for the church, and also then in memory of a few other people as well. The organ was rededicated in 2008 because there was some significant work done to it. It was actually expanded in the altar area and brought out more into the altar area so that they could create a swell box. So it actually doesn't only just play loud anymore because we have this little swell box that was put in there, but it's a beautiful instrument.